Last week we've been studying through the book of Genesis on Sunday nights. We got to Joseph last week. And Joseph, as you'll recall, in fact, Kevin did read tonight, right? I had that all confused this morning, I find out. But Kevin read from the very end of the book that we see that Joseph is still alive at the end of the book of Genesis. In fact, the book of Exodus starts with the statement that there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. So we are into the last patriarch, if you will, that will take us to the end of this book. And we looked last week at the fact we called Joseph a big dreamer. And his dreams, as well as his parental partiality, got him into a lot of trouble. Well, this evening, I've entitled this lesson, Dream Weaver. And we see in this section of Scripture, Joseph has went from interpreting or giving his own dreams to interpreting the dreams of others. And what we'll be looking at is chapters 39 through 41 in a few moments. I do want to take a moment in our introduction and address chapter 38 because there's been a lot of things taught about chapter 38, and I want to give a little bit of background to that as we go across it, and also to note as we're talking about being thankful for the lives we have, our spiritual blessings we have through Jesus Christ, right? And chapter 38 and chapters like that, though, tell us and should make us happy and thankful that we didn't live in times like this, because this was hard times. But Judah has a few sons, a couple of sons. And we noted last week when it came to Joseph that he was tattletelling, and that got him in trouble. Do you remember that, Ella? That Joseph tattled? Ella, this is Ella over here. Do you remember that from last week, that tattletelling got Joseph in trouble? Yeah, that got me in a little bit of hot water. But that's not to suggest that the tattletelling was where the real evil was, right? The evil was in the fact that his brothers were involved with things they ought not be involved with. And we see this impact every part of them. And that I think helps, should be a healthy reminder to all of us. Because there is an aspect to all of us that thinks that we can isolate our sins, right? That we can go ahead and dabble a little bit in sin and we'll keep it kind of penned in and off to the side, and it won't affect the rest of me, it won't affect the rest of my psyche, it won't affect my loved ones, it won't affect anyone else. But the reality of sin is that it impacts everything that it comes in contact with. And there can't possibly be a greater example of that than the contrast between Genesis chapter 2 and Genesis 6, with chapter 3 being in the middle there, where sin is entered into the world. So Joseph's brothers are not surrounding themselves with the kind of behavior they should. So one of Judah's sons marries a lady by the name of Tamar. And he is struck dead by God because he is evil. And we've mentioned this before, but the custom, and then later we're going to see it's in the law of God, but at this point it's still a custom and likely ordained by God, was that if you were married and your husband died, then you immediately or automatically rather married the next oldest sibling. Why would that be? I think The primary reason is that this life was so hard, that it was so physical, that women were at a tremendous disadvantage to even survive or to make a living. We see in the curse that God addresses Adam and he tells him that the ground is essentially going to revolt against him. Why is he not telling Eve that? What he's saying is the work is going to be so physical that you're going to struggle to get it done. There's no 40-hour work weeks in the book of Genesis, right? There's no pension, there's no vacation time, there's no sick leave, there's none of these things. And the ground is fighting against you. Again, I always like to refer the only two people I know here that are familiar with plowing with horses are Eddie and Dean. And if you think about it, there's thousands of years of advancement between what used to happen with horses and a plow and what we're talking about in Genesis. So it was important that she remarry. The problem is, son number 2 is evil, and he dies. Now, it's difficult to see our own shortcomings, isn't it? Case in point. Yesterday, Dad was with me. I referenced this morning. I borrowed a trailer yesterday, and as I was coming out Brookville after dropping off the piece of equipment that I dropped off, one of Brookville's finest noticed that the trailer I borrowed was out of registration. And there was no leeway, no warning or anything like that. After she relieved me of $205, I smiled and told her Happy Easter. She smiled back. I told Mike, we both were smiling. I think she's the only one that really meant it. Now, I'm irritated by that. I borrowed a trailer, trying to do something productive, and you pull up behind me at a red light, and wow. Whose fault is it? Mine, right? I don't like it. I could make a case, I have a little bit of leniency, all kind of things. It's my responsibility. It's bottom line. It's the law, right? I don't like looking at that way. I'd sooner complain about the lack of leniency and the nitpicking of the local. So anyhow, you get the point, right? We better not go any further down that road. Judah doesn't look and say, I've set a bad pattern for my sons. My sons are getting involved with some of the same things I'm getting involved with. And the reason I'm confident I can say that is later in the chapter, he's hiring his own daughter-in-law unwittingly as a prostitute. This problem's not a son issue alone. But one of the things that I wanted to address is that there's a lot of teaching about contraceptives based out of this chapter, because in verse 9, son number 2 takes action to not have an offspring. And there's all kinds of conclusions made about that. With everything I said, and when we see the law that's given later, the significance of that, in my mind, is quite clear. If they'd had an offspring, the offspring would have counted as his brother's offspring. Why? Because of the inheritance of land would have been to him. That's how they kept their people in their inheritable land. Son number 2 is trying to sidestep that process. It's not about contraceptives. It's about making sure that his brother doesn't have a lineage to follow. You have questions about that? If you're under 12, ask your parents. If you're over 12, ask Ernie. And with that, we'll move into chapter 39, which really isn't a whole lot less, difficult to deal with in some of the political correctness, is it? The message that really jumps out to me by Joseph is that when we do what's right, doesn't mean things are necessarily going to be easy. And when things are going awful, and I'm dissatisfied with my life, and maybe I should be dissatisfied with what's going on in my life, it doesn't mean that I'm not doing what's right, or God's not using me, or that I'm not where God wants me to be. In other words, does God want me sold into slavery? Well, if I'm Joseph, yes. Does God want me thrown into prison falsely? Well, if I'm Joseph, yes. You see, we have ways of defining things. We have a path, I certainly have a path that I want to be on, and where I want to be, and the kind of life I want to live. But it's not always what God has in store for me. Joseph probably had some big plans, right? But do you think he could have ever, fathomed what God had in store for him? As far as redeeming, saving a nation? In many regards, being responsible for the birth of a nation? 70 souls enter Egypt. Estimates are anywhere between 2 and 6 million people leave it. They're saved because God used Joseph. The point being that it doesn't always go the way we want, but God is in control, and he has ultimate good in mind. The golden text for tonight is from the 50th chapter, and Kevin read 15 through 21. But I want to use the end of verse 19 and verse 20 to illustrate this point that I am looking at. Starting in verse 19, here his brothers have come to Joseph, and Jacob is just died. Now, Grandpa, one of the sayings he always had was, a liar thinks everyone lies, and a thief thinks everyone steals. I had an individual that I was working with, and he just kept on me and kept on me and kept on me. And quite honestly, he wasn't known for being upright, but it drove him crazy that I didn't lock things. I didn't lock my truck on my farm. I didn't lock at the time, the trailer door. I didn't lock my shed up. I didn't lock all these things up. He just kept harping and harping and harping on me. And I told him one day, used his name, and I said, my grandfather always had a pretty interesting saying, and I told him that. Boy, he turned a little red in the face, and that was the last I heard about locking my doors. There's a lot of truth in that. A liar thinks everyone lies, and a thief thinks everyone steals. And these brothers that have sold Joseph into slavery, even at the end of Jacob's life, they can't even conceive that Joseph has truly forgiven them. They say, he's just waiting for Dad to die so he can chop our heads off. I don't know how they thought they were going to die, but they were pretty certain it was going to be bad, right? And so they come to Joseph and they start making their case. Why did they think that? They had surrounded themselves with that kind of thought process and that kind of behavior. I made reference this morning of the hell within me. The further we get away from God, the more miserable our lives become. And again, Joseph's life is example that our life isn't perfectly smooth with God, but it's far better with God than what it is without him. But Joseph's response is incredible. At the end of verse 19, he says, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God?" He says, am I God to judge you? I'm not going to do it. Not going to do it. Verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." God meant it for good. Joseph is saying, even when you're trying to harm me, God's in control. And he understood the good that God had in store. Now, with that in mind, we're going to start in chapter 39, and we don't have just one short context or passage to read from and to use as an expository lesson tonight. Rather, I want to look at the 7 steps to honor by Joseph, or of Joseph. I mentioned some of the low points for Joseph. He finds himself, I'm assuming, tied, although I'm not certain he was tied, in the bottom of, thankfully, a dry well, right? Put there by his brothers who are contemplating his death, but find that it's far more righteous rather to sell him into the hands of slave traders. So he finds himself in slavery, and then it's not long after that he finds himself falsely accused and imprisoned for crimes that he didn't even think about, let alone commit. And those are the low points of Joseph's life. But Joseph also had a lot of high points. You see, Joseph, once he's sold into slavery, finds himself at the head of Potiphar's household. In fact, he says, and Potiphar refers to it, that Potiphar doesn't even have to think about what has to take place. He just counts on it taking place. And so he gives a great deal of power to Joseph and leeway to Joseph. Joseph was successful. But as I just mentioned, that goes downhill. He gets thrown in prison. But guess what happens in prison? Joseph rises to the top of where you can be in prison. Now, that's only so high, right? But Joseph is at the top, so that we'll see in a few minutes that it said of Joseph that nothing took place in the prison that Joseph didn't do. If it was done, Joseph was head over it. That's success, even if it's in prison. But then Joseph gets out of prison, and you keep that, or you unchain that kind of success, and it's going to cause waves, and it certainly did, because Joseph finds himself number 2 in all of Egypt. That's success. Now, I don't anticipate, although I don't know what the future holds, that any of us will roll over Egypt anytime soon. But I think there's some lessons we can learn to be successful in our lives from Joseph. There's 7 of them, so we will go through them quickly at this point. Number 1, as you look at chapter 39, we'll look at verses 2 and 3, and we will see the godly influence of Joseph. Verse 2. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. Well, Joseph's brothers were being influenced by the things of this world. Joseph is being influenced by God. I say this quite oftentimes, but youngsters, once you start to understand them, you start to think about them, I don't think there's a more amazing read than the book of Proverbs. While you're young, spend time reading the Proverbs. While I was in college, I read through it, I don't know how many times, but I just read through it constantly and back through it constantly. There are more things in that book that will help you succeed in every facet of life than you can possibly imagine. And here's the secret to it. It's not just a self-help book, it's of God. That's the kind of impact you want, you need. Joseph had a godly influence, and that helped him to succeed. Secondly, as we move on to verses 5 and 6, we see in Joseph a business honesty. You know that old adage, good guys finish last? I'm not sure how, there's occasions where that's true. I'm not sure how accurate it is. In fact, I disbelieve it. Cheating and stealing absolutely will and can get you ahead in the short term. But it's not a long-term game, not a long-run game. Notice in verses 5 and 6 what's said of Joseph. For the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge. And because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now, you know what we hear a lot? And again, particularly on Sunday night, seems like I talk to our young folks a lot. These things apply to all of us. But you youngsters, you're setting the habits that are going to serve you for the rest of your lives. The rest of us are a little closer to the end of those lives. And some of our patterns are set. But the message is here for all of us. One of the messages that you hear about the workplace right now is, oh, well, they'll just take advantage of you. You do a good job there and the company makes more money and you don't even get recognized. They just make more money. As though it's a bad thing that someone else benefit from you doing a good job. Imagine if Joseph was concerned about other people benefiting from him doing a good job. You think he'd ever been the head of Potiphar's house? Yea, the head of Egypt? Absolutely not. The most honest we can be in business is to make sure other people benefit from us. Joseph wasn't envious of other people's gains. He was honest. Thirdly, we see a resistance to temptation. A specific kind of temptation, because there's other temptations that come in what we just read. But verses 7 through 9, and after a time his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph and said, "Lie with me." Language of seduction was a little different then. But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house, and he has put everything that he has in my charge. He is not greater in this house than is he not greater in this house than I am? Nor has he kept back anything from me except you, because you are his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" Another common adage we hear today is, if it feels right, it must be right. Pursue what you want. Pursue what you desire. There are unhealthy desires in this life. There are unhealthy desires in our minds. There's temptation before us. Something that's been noted many times is you notice the progression that Joseph makes. How can I do this? You want to talk about what giving into sin does? It deteriorates me. How can I do this? Secondly, back to the idea we just mentioned, the person that put him in charge. How could I do this to Potiphar? He's elevating. And thirdly, he says, how could I do this against God? And it's with this that I think we see that there is no such thing as private sin. Sin costs, and costs drastically. Joseph was willing to hold off on temptation, to resist temptation. In verse 21 of this same chapter, we see a divine favor. Now, a lot of these we've kind of looked at about what Joseph did. But the fact of the matter is, we could do everything right and not get ahead, not be successful, right? And so we need to be thankful to our Heavenly Father, because verse 21 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison." Now, there's lots to this. But on our primary point, I want to note that Joseph was successful because of the divine favor. Now, did anyone catch where this divine favor at this particular time is being shown? Sharon did. In prison. I'm so blessed. Lord, how about I be blessed outside this prison cell? Right? Lord, I'll tell you what blessed would be. Have you ever been ready to define being blessed to God? Joseph was being blessed in prison. I think we see a willingness of Joseph to be blessed in prison. And because he was willing to be blessed in prison, he was blessed outside of prison. His success was because of the divine favor of God. Number 5, because of providential circumstances. Chapter 40, verses 5 and 8. We don't know when opportunity is going to arise, do we? How many of you, when you look back at your life and you think about the biggest opportunity in your life, how many of you saw it coming ahead of time? Ella saw it. And Anna. Right? Normally, big opportunities catch us unaware. In fact, I had a businessman tell me years ago, and I found it to be true. He said, Mike, the biggest opportunities in life will always present themselves in the most inopportune times. I find a lot of truth to that. My point being, we have to be ready to seize opportunity. You can't wait until the opportunity arises and then prepare for it. We need to be preparing, so we're prepared when the opportunity arises. Providential circumstances, verses 5 through 8. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, on each of his own dream. Each dreamed with his own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." I know it's not the end of the verse. Let's pause there for just a second, though. Can't you see Joseph? Now, we understand he wasn't just sitting, right? That's the other thing. Opportunities don't normally come to people sitting. If you sit a lot, that's figuratively. So Joseph is sitting in prison. What can he do? Not much. These gentlemen walked up. Notice too, that his opportunity came because he noticed other people. Why are you sad today? How many people do we pass in life and never notice where they're at? Well, I'll tell you why we're upset, they said. We've had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. There it is. Joseph says, I'm in. God put me here for this moment. Do not interpretations, he says, belong to the Lord or belong to God. Please tell me them. Providential circumstances. Be easy after he interpreted these dreams to forget God, wouldn't it? Or to feel like God forgot him. Because I mentioned this opportunity, he interprets these dreams. And if you recall the time frame to both the cupbearer and the baker wasn't going to repay any favors, right? Things didn't turn out well for him. But the time frame on these dreams coming to fruition was 3 days. I can't help but think of Joseph saying to himself, oh, this cupbearer's going to be out here in 3 days. Then God will use him to set me free. How long later? 2 years. 2 years later, and the cupbearer says, oh, that's right. Now that I need Joseph, I remember him. Now that I need him, I recall he's still rotting away in prison from 2 years ago. But notice chapter 41, verse 16, Joseph never gave up on God. Joseph answered Pharaoh, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh a favorable answer." He's finally before Pharaoh to interpret Pharaoh's dream. He says, I'm not capable of doing it. He doesn't end there, though, does he? But God can. Lastly, divine revelations. Chapter 41, verses 25 and 26. And Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good ears are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 lean and the ugly cows that came up from them are 7 years, and the 7 empty ears blighted by the east wind are also 7 years of famine. Divine revelations. You say, well, Mike, what relevance does that have to me? Have you not received your divine revelations? 7 steps to honor. Godly influence, business honesty, resistance to temptation, divine favor, providential circumstances, honoring God, and divine revelations. May you be successful in sharing the gospel of Christ this week and in weeks to come. If anyone else is your master, if you have a spiritual need we can help you with, I encourage you to make that known as together we stand and sing.